The silence was the loudest thing in the room, louder than the crackle of the kindling in the hearth, louder than the wind that scraped dry branches against the cabin walls. It was a hollow, ringing silence that had taken up residence in Eleanor's head the day the barn burned down, and it had not left since. 3 days now. 3 days since Thomas was gone, consumed by the fire along with the splintered stalls and the last of the winter hay. She sat on a hard-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap, her spine as straight and unyielding as the barren fence posts outside. She was 22, a bride of 4 years and a widow of 3 days. Numbness was a mercy, a thick blanket of fog that kept the feelings at bay. Grief was not among them. The space Thomas had occupied in her life was now a void, but it was a quiet void, a peaceful one. The town, however, did not deal in quiet voids. It dealt in whispers. When she walked into Jericho Springs that morning, the whispers followed her like a cloud of biting flies. The dust of the main street rose to greet her, a fine red powder that settled on the hem of her worn black dress and clung to the perspiration on her brow. She kept her eyes fixed on the warped planks of the boardwalk, but she could feel the stairs. They were heavy, physical things, pressing on her from all sides. From the doorway of the saloon, men who had shared liquor with her husband fell silent, their eyes tracking her progress with a mixture of morbid curiosity and suspicion. She saw the sheriff, a portly man named Miller with a drooping mustache, watching her from the window of his office, his gaze as heavy as a judgment. He had asked her questions the day after the fire, his voice deceptively gentle. "Where were you, Eleanor, when the flames took hold? Did you and Thomas have words?" She had answered in a monotone, her voice a stranger's in her own ears. "In the bedroom, asleep. No words, not that night." The women were worse. Mrs. Gable, the pastor's wife, stopped her outside the mercantile, her face a mask of sorrowful pity that did not quite reach her eyes. "Oh, you poor dear," she cooed, her hand fluttering near Eleanor's arm but not quite touching, as if widowhood were a contagion. "Such a tragedy. To be left all alone, if there is anything the good Lord or I can do." Eleanor murmured a thank you and moved past her, the woman's cloying perfume making her stomach clench. She preferred the outright contempt of the others. A trio of matrons, their bonnets tied in tight, unforgiving bows, huddled by the smithy. Their whispers were just loud enough for her to catch the venom. "Look at her, not a tear in her eye. Cold as a winter snake, that one." Thomas complained of her moods, said she was difficult. Difficult. That was one of Thomas's words for her. He had many: stubborn, ungrateful, willful. He had used them like a whip, leaving welts on her spirit that no one could see. He had used his hands, too, leaving bruises on her body that she had learned to hide beneath long sleeves and high collars. She unconsciously touched the back of her neck, where the ghost of a faded yellow mark lingered beneath her tightly pinned hair. The land he had left her was a testament to his character. The homestead was a mile out of town, a hard-bitten piece of earth that had broken better men than him. Thomas had not been a good man, nor a good farmer. The fields were choked with weeds. The soil cracked and starved for rain. The small cabin was drafty. The roof leaked, and the well threatened to run dry with every passing week of relentless, sun-bleached sky. It was all hers now, the dust, the decay, and the debt. The debt was the heaviest part of the inheritance. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the scent of coffee beans, cured leather, and sawdust. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, gave her a curt nod from behind the counter. He was a decent man, but he was a businessman first, and she knew her credit had died with Thomas. She placed her meager list on the counter: flour, salt, a little lard. She counted out the coins from a small cloth pouch, her fingers stiff. One of the pennies slipped from her grasp, rolling across the floorboards and coming to a stop near a pair of scuffed, heavy boots. She bent to retrieve it, her movements slow, her body aching with a weariness that had nothing to do with physical labor. As she reached for the coin, she looked up and met the gaze of the man wearing the boots. He was a rancher from the high country, a man she knew by sight but not by name. Daniel, that was it, Daniel Hayes. He was in his mid-30s, his face weathered by sun and wind into a rugged mask. His hair was the color of dark earth, and his eyes were a startling, clear gray, the color of a stormy sky over the mountains. He was broad-shouldered and lean, a man made of sinew and quiet strength. He was buying sacks of grain and lengths of rope, the tools of a man who worked the land instead of fighting it. He watched her, his expression unreadable. There was no pity in his eyes, no accusation. He simply looked at her, a long, steady gaze that saw the tremor in her hand as she picked up the penny. He did not offer to help. He did not speak. When she stood up, their eyes met for a second longer before he turned back to the counter, his voice a low rumble as he spoke to Henderson. Just the grain for now, and the rope. Eleanor paid for her supplies, bundled them in a small sack, and left without another word. She felt his eyes on her back as she walked out the door, a strange, neutral weight that was somehow more unnerving than the open hostility of the others. That evening, the world seemed to shrink to the four walls of her cabin. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving behind a bruised purple twilight. She ate a piece of dry bread, the flour tasting like dust in her mouth. She had not cried. She had wondered if she was broken, if Thomas had finally succeeded in chipping away at her until there was nothing left inside to feel. A knock at the door made her jump. It was a sharp, impatient sound. Visitors were rare and never welcome. She opened the door a crack, her heart suddenly a frantic bird against her ribs. Mr. Abernathy, the town banker, stood on her porch. He was a man in his 50s, with soft hands and a fleshy face that was always damp with a thin sheen of sweat. He smiled, a practiced, oily gesture that did not involve his eyes. "Good evening, Mrs. Webb," he said, tipping his hat. "May I have a word?" She did not want to let him in, but refusing him was not a choice she felt she had. He stepped inside, his presence filling the small room, smelling of bay rum and something sour. He did not waste time with condolences. "I have been reviewing your husband's accounts," he began, pulling a sheaf of papers from his coat. "It is, I am afraid, not a pretty picture." He laid the papers out on the rough-hewn table. Figures and columns swam before Eleanor's eyes. Mortgages, loans, debts to the mercantile, the feed store, the blacksmith. It was a mountain of debt, an impossible sum. "The long and short of it, my dear, is that the bank owns this land, and everything on it," Abernathy said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Foreclosure proceedings will begin at the end of the month." Eleanor stared at him, the silence in her head roaring back to life. To lose this place, as much as she hated it, as much as it was a prison built by Thomas, it was all she had, the only place in the world she had any claim to. To be cast out would mean, she did not know what it would mean, the almshouse, perhaps, or worse. "I have no money," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Abernathy's eyes roamed over her, lingering on the line of her throat, the shape of her beneath the drab dress. His smile widened. "Perhaps money is not the only currency we might deal in. A man in my position can be flexible. An arrangement could be made. A young, attractive woman like yourself. You need not be out on the street. We could come to an understanding that benefits us both." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It was the same veiled threat, the same transactional filth that had defined her marriage. Thomas had seen her as property, a thing to be used for his comfort and his needs. This man saw her as the same, a commodity to be bartered. Something inside Eleanor, something she thought had died, snapped. The numbness shattered, and in its place was a white-hot surge of fury. It was the rage of a cornered animal, a pure, clean fire of defiance. Her hand shot out, not to strike him, but to snatch the heavy iron poker from its stand by the hearth. She hefted it, the weight of it solid and real in her hand. Her eyes, which had been downcast and empty all day, now blazed with a light that made Abernathy take a startled step back. "Get out!" she said, her voice low and shaking with the force of her rage. He held up his soft hands. Now, Eleanor, let's not be hasty." "Get out of my house!" she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. She took a step forward, the poker raised. "Get out before I split your skull with this." For the first time, Abernathy looked afraid. He saw that she meant it. He scrambled backward, fumbling with the door latch, his face pale in the lamplight. He stumbled off the porch and into the darkness without another word, leaving the scent of his fear behind him. The door slammed shut. The poker fell from Eleanor's hand, clattering onto the floor. And then she was running. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away from that house, from the town, from the memory of Thomas and the predatory eyes of Abernathy. She ran out into the night, her thin shoes stumbling over the rutted track. The brewing storm in the sky had broken, and a cold, biting wind tore at her hair, whipping it free from its pins. She ran past the dead fields and the broken fences, into the wilderness of sagebrush and rock that stretched out beyond the homestead. The landscape was treacherous in the dark, a maze of gullies and sharp-edged stones. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. She tripped, her ankle twisting violently, and fell hard, her hands and knees scraping against the gravelly earth. The pain was sharp, a grounding shock that finally broke through the last of her control. She lay there, crumpled on the unforgiving ground, and wept. She wept for the girl she had been, a girl who had once dreamed of love and a gentle life. She wept for the years Thomas had stolen from her, for the fear and the loneliness. She wept for the rage that had just saved her, an emotion so powerful it terrified her. She cried until there were no tears left, only a deep, shuddering exhaustion that pulled her down into a black, dreamless void. The first thing she was aware of was the cold. It was a deep, biting cold that had seeped into her bones. The sky above was no longer black, but a pale, washed-out gray. Dawn. She was lying at the bottom of a shallow ravine, her dress torn, her skin caked with dirt and dried blood from her fall. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest as she tried to move. Her ankle throbbed with a searing pain. A shadow fell over her. She flinched, her body tensing, expecting to see Abernathy, or the sheriff, or some other specter of her haunted life. But it was him, the rancher from the store, Daniel Hayes. He stood on the edge of the ravine, looking down at her. He was leading a horse, and he had a rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. His face was grim, his gray eyes taking in her torn dress, her bloodied hands, her exhausted and broken state. He did not speak. He slid down the loose scree of the embankment with an easy, sure-footed grace. He knelt beside her, his presence large and solid in the cold morning air. Still, he said nothing. He simply looked at her, his gaze missing nothing. He saw the terror that flashed in her eyes, the way she tried to pull away, to make herself smaller. He shrugged off the heavy wool coat he was wearing and gently, impersonally, draped it over her shivering body. The coat was warm and smelled of wood smoke, leather, and the clean scent of the pines from the high country. He then reached down, sliding one arm under her back and the other beneath her knees. Eleanor gasped, a raw sound of fear. "No," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "Don't." He paused, his hands holding her but not lifting. He looked directly into her eyes. His own were steady, unblinking. "You'll freeze out here," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. It was the first time she had ever heard him speak more than a few words. She was too weak, too cold, too broken to fight. A tremor ran through her, a shudder of pure exhaustion. She gave a small, defeated nod. He lifted her then, as if she weighed nothing at all. The movement was smooth and efficient. He carried her up out of the ravine and set her on his horse, settling her in front of the saddle before swinging up behind her. She was rigid, her back ramrod straight, careful not to lean against the solid wall of his chest. He seemed to understand, keeping a careful distance as he took the reins. The ride to his ranch was long and silent. Eleanor drifted in and out of a dazed consciousness, aware only of the rhythmic plodding of the horse, the warmth of the coat, and the solid presence of the man behind her who did not touch her more than was absolutely necessary to keep her from falling. His ranch was nestled in a valley high in the foothills, a world away from the parched flatlands of her own homestead. The log house was sturdy and well built, flanked by a large, solid barn and neat, fenced-in corrals. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a welcome plume against the gray sky. It looked like a place of safety, a place of strength. He carried her inside and laid her on a simple cot in a small, sparse room off the main living area. The room was clean and smelled of cedar. He built up the fire in the main room's hearth until it was blazing, chasing the chill from the air. He brought her a dipper of water, holding it to her lips so she could drink, his movements careful and deliberate. She watched him, her fear warring with a desperate, bone-deep weariness. He was a stranger, a man, and men were not safe. When she had drunk her fill, he stood back, his face unreadable as ever. "You can stay," he said, the words stark in the quiet room, "till you're well." The offer of charity, of dependence, was like a slap. Her pride, the last tattered remnant of who she was, flared to life. She pushed herself up on her elbows, ignoring the protest of her aching body. "I don't take charity," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I'll work for my keep." He looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes seeming to see right through her, to the terror and the desperate need for dignity that lay beneath her words. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Fine," he said. "You can work." He turned to leave the room, then stopped in the doorway. He looked back at her, his expression serious, his voice low and firm, cutting through the fear that was already beginning to coil in her stomach. "One thing," he said, and he waited until her eyes met his. "You won't be touched." It was not a threat. It was a promise. The first promise of safety she had been given in 4 long years. And in the ringing silence that followed, Eleanor felt the first, tiny, fragile flicker of something she had thought was lost to her forever, a sliver of peace. She closed her eyes and let the darkness take her, not into the void of despair, but into the quiet possibility of sleep. The days at Daniel Hayes's ranch fell into a rhythm, as slow and steady as a heartbeat. It was a quiet life, measured by sunrises and sunsets, by the needs of the animals and the turning of the seasons. Eleanor found a strange comfort in the simplicity of it. Her hands, once idle and trembling, now found purpose in mending worn denim shirts, the needle a small, silver fish darting through the coarse fabric. She learned the quirks of the old wood stove, how to coax a steady heat from it to bake bread that filled the small cabin with a warm, yeasty scent. She swept the floors, scrubbed the pine table until it gleamed, and washed their few dishes in a basin of hot water. These were the tasks of a wife. But here, they felt different. They were not duties performed under a watchful, critical eye. They were her contribution, her work, the price of her stay. Daniel was a man of profound silence. He was gone before the sun crested the mountains, and he often returned long after it had set, his face streaked with the grime of his work, his body moving with a bone-deep weariness. He never intruded on her space. In the morning, she would find a bucket of fresh, cold water from the well waiting on the porch, and next to it, a stack of firewood. He had moved a simple cot and his own belongings into the barn, and he never entered the house without first knocking firmly on the door, a courtesy that was so foreign to her it felt like a staggering act of grace. They rarely spoke. Meals were eaten at the small table, the space between them filled only with the scrape of forks on tin plates. He would nod his thanks, his eyes briefly meeting hers before returning to his food. She would nod in return. Words were not necessary. His silence was not the menacing, judgmental silence of her late husband. It was a quiet that was solid and unassuming, a silence that did not demand to be filled. It was a silence that gave her room to breathe. But the peace she found in the daylight was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the coming of night. In the darkness of her small room, the ghosts of her marriage returned. Sleep offered no escape, only a different kind of prison. She would be back in the cabin with Thomas, the air thick with the smell of whiskey and his rage. She would feel the phantom grip of his fingers on her arm, hear his voice, thick with scorn, mocking her for a burnt meal or a misplaced tool. Stupid girl. Useless. Did you really think anyone else would have you? Sometimes the dreams were worse. They were flashes of violence, the shocking pain of a blow, the terror of being cornered. She would wake with a choked cry, her body slick with sweat, tremors racking her from head to toe. She would curl into a tight ball on the cot, pressing her face into the rough blanket, her hands clenched into fists to stop their shaking. Guilt was a constant, suffocating companion in those dark hours. The town's whispers echoed in her mind, not a tear in her eye, cold as a winter snake. Had she wanted him dead? Had some dark part of her willed the fire into existence? The thought was a venomous serpent, coiling in her gut. She had not loved him, but she had been his wife. The vows she had taken, "Till death do us part," had become a curse, and his death had not set her free. It had only branded her with a different kind of shame. Daniel never mentioned her troubled nights, but she knew he heard. Sometimes, in the deepest part of the night after a particularly bad dream, she would hear the soft, rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood outside, the steady thud, a comforting, solid presence in the terrifying dark. It was as if he knew she was awake and was standing guard, not over her, but over the silence, keeping the world at bay. He had 2 ranch hands, a grizzled old man named Jeb and a younger, wiry cowboy called Walt. They lived in a small bunkhouse near the corrals and kept to themselves. They were polite enough to her face, tipping their hats and calling her ma'am, but their eyes held the same suspicion she had seen in town. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 pines, their voices drifted over from the corral where they were mending a fence. "Still can't figure why the boss took her in," Walt said, his voice a low grumble. "She's trouble, that one. A woman whose husband burns up in a barn ain't natural." "The boss has his reasons," Jeb replied, his tone weary. "Ain't our place to question 'em? Reasons or not, folks in town are talking. Say Thomas Webb had a mean streak, but maybe she deserved it. Maybe she pushed him too far. A woman like that, she brings calamity with her." Eleanor froze, a wooden clothespin clutched in her hand. Maybe she deserved it. The words were a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She had spent 4 years believing those words, hearing them whispered in the back of her mind with every harsh word and every shove from Thomas. To hear them spoken aloud by a stranger, to have her private shame made into public gossip, was a fresh and terrible violation. She grabbed the laundry basket and fled back into the house, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was an outcast, a pariah, even here, in this quiet valley. Her past was a stain she could not wash away. Weeks turned into a month. The raw scrape on her knee healed into a pale scar, and the ache in her ankle subsided to a dull throb. She grew stronger, the rhythms of the ranch becoming her own. She began to anticipate Daniel's needs, leaving a hot pot of coffee on the stove for his return, mending a tear in his coat before he even noticed it was there, and he, in his own quiet way, cared for her. When he rode to town for supplies, he returned with a small bag of whorehound candies and a new spool of thread, leaving them on the table without comment. They were small kindnesses, but to Eleanor, who had known only cruelty and neglect, They were monumental. One evening, he did not return at his usual time. The sun sank below the peaks, and the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. A storm was brewing in the west, the air heavy and charged. Eleanor paced the small cabin, a knot of unfamiliar anxiety tightening in her chest. She told herself it was foolish. He was a capable man, but the darkness deepened, and still, he did not come. It was nearly midnight when she heard it, the slow, stumbling gait of a horse, and then a heavy thud against the cabin door. She rushed to open it, her lantern held high. Daniel was slumped against the doorframe, his face pale beneath a mask of dust and dried blood. His shirt was torn, and a long, ugly gash ran along his forearm. He was swaying on his feet, his gray eyes clouded with exhaustion. He had been breaking wild horses, a dangerous and brutal business, and from the look of him, the horses had nearly won. He tried to speak, but only a low groan escaped his lips. He took one unsteady step into the room, and then his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the floor in a heap of worn leather and exhausted muscle. For a moment, Eleanor could only stare, her mind blank with shock. Then, something broke through the fear. It was a fierce, protective instinct she did not know she possessed. She set the lantern down and knelt beside him. "Daniel," she said, her voice soft but urgent. She touched his shoulder, her first time ever making contact with him. He was burning with fever, with a strength she did not know she had. She managed to drag him across the floor, closer to the warmth of the fire. She pulled off his dusty boots and his torn shirt, her movements clumsy but determined. His chest and arms were a roadmap of bruises, some old and faded, others a fresh, angry purple. The gash on his arm was deep and crusted with dirt. She worked quickly, her fear replaced by a focused resolve. She brought a basin of warm water and a clean cloth from the kitchen. She knelt beside him again, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had to clean the wound. She had to touch him. Her hands trembled as she dipped the cloth into the water. She hesitated for a second, the memories of Thomas, of unwanted, brutal touch, rising like bile in her throat. But then she looked at Daniel's face, slack with exhaustion, his usual stoic mask gone, leaving him looking vulnerable and strangely young. This was not Thomas. This was the man who had pulled her from a ravine, who had given her shelter, who slept in a barn so she could feel safe. She took a deep, steadying breath and began to clean the gash on his arm. Her touch was feather-light at first, tentative. He did not stir. Gaining confidence, she worked more firmly, cleaning the dirt from the wound, her hands moving with a gentle efficiency. She washed the dust and dried blood from his face, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw, the weary creases around his eyes. He was made of hard angles and rough textures, a man shaped by the unforgiving land he worked. A strange tenderness bloomed in her chest. It was a dangerous, unfamiliar feeling. In a moment of weakness, a moment of unguarded compassion, she leaned over him, her hair brushing against his cheek as she reached for a fresh cloth. It was that small, intimate touch that woke him. His eyes flew open, not clouded and weary, but sharp and wild with disorientation. Before she could react, before he could even register who she was, his hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist in an iron grip. It was a purely instinctual reflex, the action of a man fighting his way out of a violent dream. But for Eleanor, it was a nightmare made real. The sudden, hard pressure on her wrist, the feeling of being trapped. It was Thomas all over again. A scream tore from her throat, a raw, terrified sound. She flinched back violently, yanking her arm away. Her elbow hit the basin of water, sending it crashing to the floor. It shattered, the sound of the breaking ceramic as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. "Don't!" she gasped, scrambling backward on her hands and knees until her back hit the wall. "Don't touch me like that!" Her voice was a ragged whisper, her whole body shaking uncontrollably. The fog of sleep and pain cleared from Daniel's eyes. He saw her cowering against the wall, her face a mask of pure terror. He saw her wrist, where the red marks of his fingers were already beginning to form. He saw the shattered bowl, the water spreading across the floorboards, and a look of profound, gut-wrenching shame washed over his face. He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. He pushed himself up, away from her, his movements clumsy with haste and horror. He backed away until he was on the other side of the room, putting as much space between them as possible. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with remorse. I'm sorry, I was dreaming." But she could not hear his apology. She was trapped in the past, her breath coming in short, painful sobs. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold herself together, trying to stop the violent tremors that shook her frame. He stood there, helpless, watching her. The shame on his face was warring with a deep, aching sorrow. He looked at his own hand, the one that had grabbed her, as if it were a traitorous thing he did not recognize. He had made her a promise. You won't be touched, and he had broken it. He had become the thing she feared most. Slowly, as the seconds ticked by, Eleanor's panic began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear awareness. She looked at him, truly looked at him, standing across the room, his shoulders slumped, his face a picture of self-loathing. He was not angry. He was not defensive. He was ashamed. And more than that, he looked afraid. He was not afraid of her. He was afraid of what he had done to her. In that moment, she realized a startling, earth-shattering truth. He was just as scared of hurting her as she was of being hurt. The realization did not stop her shaking, but it changed the nature of it. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken pain. Finally, Daniel moved, not toward her, but toward the door. He paused, his hand on the latch. "The wound," he said, his voice low and strained. "Thank you for tending to it." And then he was gone, retreating back into the cold night, leaving her alone with the shattered pieces of the bowl and the even more shattered pieces of her composure. She could not sleep. The cabin felt too small, the air too thick with what had happened. She needed space. She needed to walk. She pulled on a shawl and slipped out into the night. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and cold. A full moon hung in the sky, bathing the valley in a pale, ethereal light. She found herself drawn to the barn, its large, dark shape a solid silhouette against the starry sky. The door was ajar, and a soft yellow light spilled out from within. She peered inside. Daniel was not there. A single lantern burned on a crate, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. This was his space, his sanctuary. She stepped inside, the scent of hay, animals, and leather enveloping her. It was a calming, earthy smell. His cot was in a corner, a single rough blanket neatly folded on top. Beside it was a small, crudely made wooden chest. It was open. Curiosity, a feeling she had not felt in years, drew her closer. She knelt by the chest. Inside, there were a few worn books, a sharpening stone, and a small, leather-bound, tin-type photograph case. Her hands, still trembling slightly, reached for it. She opened the small brass clasp. The photograph inside was of 3 people, stiffly posed for the camera, but with an undeniable warmth in their expressions. A much younger Daniel, his face unlined by hardship, a small smile playing on his lips. Beside him, a woman with kind eyes and dark hair piled high on her head. Her hand rested on Daniel's arm, a gesture of easy affection. And sitting on Daniel's lap was a small boy, no older than 4 or 5, with his father's serious gray eyes and a shock of unruly dark hair. They were a family, a happy one. Eleanor stared at the image, her heart aching with a sorrow that was not her own. This was his past. This was the source of the profound sadness she sometimes saw in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. a wife and a son. Both gone now. She thought of the lone pine tree that stood on a hill overlooking the ranch, the one he sometimes stared at for long stretches of time. She understood now. It was not just a tree. It was a grave. She closed the case gently and placed it back in the chest, exactly where she had found it. She had stumbled upon the heart of his silence, the reason for his solitude. He was not just a man who was afraid of hurting her. He was a man who had already been broken, just like her. She backed out of the barn, leaving the lantern burning, and retreated to the house. The image of the smiling family seared into her mind. The gulf of silence between her and Daniel Hayes was still vast, but for the first time, it no longer felt empty. It was filled with a shared, unspoken grief. The morning after he collapsed, a fragile and unspoken truce settled over the cabin. The space between Eleanor and Daniel, once empty, was now filled with a new and potent awareness. It was a tension as fine and taut as a wire, humming with the memory of her terror and his shame. He did not apologize again. He was not a man for words, but his actions spoke for him. He was even more careful in his movements, his large frame seeming to shrink whenever he was near her, as if he were trying to minimize his own presence in the world. He would leave her coffee on the table in the morning and be gone, and she would find his mended shirt, neatly folded, on the porch in the evening. They were like two planets orbiting the same sun, held in place by a gravity of shared sorrow, never touching. His quiet, relentless care became a kind of balm to her frayed spirit. Thomas had offered care only when it served him, his kindness a precursor to a demand. Daniel's care was a silent, steady thing, as reliable as the sunrise. He noticed the second step on the porch was loose and fixed it without a word. When a storm blew a shingle off the roof, he was up on a ladder the next morning, hammering it back into place before the rain could get in. He never asked for thanks, and she did not know how to offer it. Instead, she baked an extra loaf of bread, or ensured the stew she made for dinner was rich with the last of the garden vegetables. It was a language of gestures, a conversation held in the space between words. But she kept her heart locked away, a cold, hard stone in her chest. Kindness was a currency she did not trust. She had seen how it could be used as a weapon, a tool of manipulation. So she watched him, her gaze guarded, waiting for the demand she was sure would come. She waited for the other boot to drop. It never did. Summer burned across the high country, and the work on the ranch was brutal and unending. The land demanded everything from them, and in the shared struggle for survival, the wire of tension between them began to slacken, replaced by the strong, simple cord of partnership. A dust storm blew in from the plains one afternoon, a monstrous, roiling wall of orange that turned the day to twilight. Daniel saw it coming and herded the horses into the barn just as the first gust of wind hit, laden with grit that stung the skin. He found Eleanor fighting to pull the laundry from the line, the sheets snapping like cannon fire in the gale. He did not touch her, but moved beside her, his large hands working quickly to unpin the clothes while she gathered them into the basket. They stumbled back into the cabin together, slamming the door against the howling wind just as the world outside disappeared into a suffocating cloud of dust. They spent the rest of the day inside, the air thick and hard to breathe. They stuffed rags into the cracks around the doors and windows, but the fine red dust still found its way in, coating every surface in a thin, gritty film. They sat at the table in the eerie orange light, the sound of the wind a living thing, a predator circling the small cabin, in the shared helplessness of the moment. A bit of Eleanor's armor chipped away. They were just two people, trapped and small against the immense, indifferent power of the land. The branding was even harder. It was a day of fire and sweat, the air filled with the smell of scorched hair and the terrified bawling of calves. Jeb and Walt worked with a grim efficiency, but they were short-handed. Daniel, seeing Eleanor watching from the porch, simply nodded toward a stack of irons in the fire. "We'll need help keeping those hot," was all he said. She did not hesitate. She spent the day by the fire, her face flushed with heat, her arms aching as she rotated the heavy branding irons, ensuring they were always ready. She watched Daniel work. He moved with a quiet, focused grace, his muscles coiling and releasing as he wrestled a calf to the ground, his voice a low, calming rumble that seemed to soothe the terrified animal even as the hot iron seared its hide. At the end of the day, they were all covered in filth and exhaustion. As they walked back toward the house, Daniel paused beside her. "Good work today," he said, his voice low. He looked at her, his gray eyes clear and direct, and in them she saw not a hint of pity or judgment, only a simple, unqualified respect. It was a look Thomas had never given her. It warmed her more than the branding fire had. Their greatest trial came in late summer, when a lightning strike on the far ridge sparked a prairie fire. For 2 days and 2 nights, they fought it side by side with Jeb and Walt. The world became a living hell of smoke and heat. They dug fire breaks until their hands were raw and blistered, their lungs burning with every breath. They beat at the creeping lines of flame with wet sacks until their bodies screamed with exhaustion. Eleanor forgot to be afraid of him, forgot to be afraid of anything but the fire. They were a team, their movements synchronized by a shared, desperate purpose. He would point, and she would run. She would shout a warning, and he would turn. On the second night, they stood on a blackened patch of earth, the fire finally contained, its angry red glow now a safe distance away. They were both swaying on their feet, their faces black with soot, their clothes reeking of smoke. In the flickering light of the dying flames, their eyes met across the space of a few feet. They had survived. Together. The knowledge was a solid, unspoken thing between them, a bond forged in the heat and terror. That night, sitting by the hearth, their bodies aching with a weariness that went bone deep, she finally spoke of the things she had kept locked away. The fire outside had burned away some of her defenses, leaving her raw and exposed.
"He locked me in the root cellar once,"
she said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. She did not look at him, her eyes fixed on the gentle dance of the flames in the fireplace. Daniel, who had been cleaning a rifle, went still. He did not speak, did not prompt her, simply waited. His stillness was an invitation. "It was the first year we were married," she continued, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I tried to run. He caught me just past the creek. He didn't hit me that time. He said he was going to teach me a lesson I wouldn't forget." She took a shaky breath. "He dragged me to the root cellar and locked the door. I was in there for 3 days. It was so dark and cold. There were spiders. I could hear him walking around above, whistling sometimes. On the 3rd day, he opened the door and just looked at me. He asked if I had learned my place. I said yes. He never mentioned it again." She fell silent, the story hanging in the air between them, a small, ugly, poisonous thing. She risked a glance at him. His face was a mask of stone, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the rifle. A muscle jumped in his jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, dangerous rumble, like rocks grinding deep in the earth. "I am sorry, Eleanor," he said, and she knew he was. He set the rifle aside and stood up, walking over to the window to stare out at the moonlit valley. For a long time, he was silent, his back to her. When he spoke again, his voice was different, stripped of its anger, leaving only a hollow, aching grief. "I lost my wife and son," he said, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. 5 years ago, fever took them. It was a bad winter." He turned from the window, and his eyes found hers. They were filled with a pain so vast and deep it stole her breath. "Sarah, she was my wife, and Sammy was our boy. He was 5. He had his mother's smile." He swallowed hard, his throat working. They went fast. First Sammy, then Sarah 2 days later. There was no one else up here. The doctor couldn't make it through the snow. I buried them myself, under that big pine tree on the hill. He pointed, though they both knew the tree she so often stared at. So that was it, the heart of his silence, the source of his sorrow. He was a man who had dug the graves of his entire world with his own 2 hands.
I am sorry, Daniel,
she whispered, echoing his own words back to him. Their shared apologies were 2 small, fragile bridges built across an immense chasm of pain. The first autumn rain came a week later. It was not a gentle shower, but a sudden, violent deluge that turned the dusty ranch yard into a sea of mud. They were caught in the open, trying to herd a spooked calf back into the barn. The sky opened up, and in seconds, they were both drenched to the skin, the cold rain plastering their clothes to their bodies. They finally managed to wrestle the calf into a stall and slammed the big barn door shut, leaving the roaring storm outside. They stood in the sudden, echoing quiet of the barn, dripping water onto the hay-strewn floor. The air was cold, and Eleanor began to shiver, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Daniel lit a lantern, its warm, yellow glow pushing back the gloom. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said, his voice rough with concern. He started to shrug off his own soaked jacket, a gesture of instinctual care. "No," she said quickly, taking a step back. The sight of him, large and powerful in the dim light, the thought of being vulnerable, it brought a fresh wave of fear. He stopped, his hands frozen in midair. He understood. He looked away, his gaze falling on an old horse blanket hanging on a hook. He took it down and held it out to her. "Here," he said, "at least take this." She took the blanket, wrapping it around her shivering shoulders. It smelled of horse and hay and him. They stood in an awkward silence, the only sound the drumming of the rain on the barn roof. The storm had trapped them, forcing them into an intimacy neither was prepared for.
I am afraid,
she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, as if it could hold her together. I am afraid of everything, of the town, of being alone, but mostly, her voice faltered. Mostly, I am afraid to feel anything again. It hurts too much. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and pleading in the lantern light. I am afraid of being touched. He looked at her, and his face was filled with a gentle, aching understanding that undid her completely. He took a slow step toward her, then another. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He did not reach for her. He did not try to hold her. He simply stood there, a solid, calming presence in the storm. He lifted his hand, his movement slow, deliberate, giving her ample time to pull away. She stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. He did not kiss her. He did not touch her face or her arms. He gently, so gently, brushed a strand of wet, dark hair from her cheek, tucking it behind her ear. His fingers barely grazed her skin, a touch as light as a moth's wing, a touch that asked for nothing. It was the kindest, most tender gesture she had ever known, and it terrified her more than any blow. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement. Her voice broke, a raw, ragged whisper. If you touch me like that again, I'll break. It was not a threat. It was a plea, a confession of her own fragility. She was a shattered thing, held together by sheer will. And she knew that a touch like that, a touch of such impossible gentleness, would be the thing to finally make her fall to pieces. Daniel pulled his hand back as if he had been scalded. He took a step away from her, his face a mask of sorrow. He looked down at his own hand, then back at her, his gray eyes filled with a deep and profound respect for her pain. Then I won't, he said, his voice low and firm, a solemn vow. He held her gaze, and the world seemed to stop. Unless you ask me to. He had given her back the one thing Thomas had stolen, her choice, the power over her own body. The words were a key, unlocking a floodgate of grief and gratitude she had kept dammed up for years. A choked sob escaped her lips, and then another, the tears she had not shed for her husband, for her stolen life, for her own brokenness. They came now, hot and unstoppable. She crumpled, not from his touch, but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of his words. She did not fall. He caught her hand. He did not pull her close or wrap his arms around her. He simply knelt in the hay in front of her and held her hand, his large, calloused fingers wrapping around hers, a solid, grounding anchor in the storm that raged both outside and within her. And as she wept, she could feel his own hand trembling just like hers. The rainstorm in the barn did not break the tension between them. It changed its nature. The wire of fear and shame was gone, replaced by something finer, stronger, and infinitely more terrifying, a thread of possibility. In his promise, unless you ask me to, Daniel had given Eleanor a gift she had forgotten existed. He had given her back the ownership of her own body, her own will. The knowledge of it was a heavy, wonderful, frightening thing. Slowly, tentatively, she began to explore the boundaries of her newfound freedom. It started with the horses. Thomas had forbidden her from riding. A horse was a tool, he'd said, not a woman's plaything. His horses were extensions of his own brutish will, and he did not share his possessions. But Daniel's horses were different. They were strong and spirited, but there was no fear in their eyes. One morning, her chores done, she stood by the corral, watching a gentle, buckskin mare. Daniel came up beside her, so quietly she didn't notice him until he spoke. "Her name is Willow," he said. "She's got a soft mouth. Easiest ride on the ranch." He did not offer to saddle the horse for her. He did not ask if she wanted to ride. He simply stated a fact and then walked away, leaving the choice entirely to her. She stood there for a long time, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Then, her movements stiff with a mixture of fear and defiance, she entered the stable, found a saddle and bridle, and approached the mare. Her hands fumbled with the straps, her fingers clumsy and unsure. But Willow stood patiently, nuzzling her shoulder as if in encouragement. That first ride was a revelation. She did not go far, just a slow walk around the perimeter of the valley. But the feeling of the horse moving beneath her, of the wind in her hair, of the world unfolding from a perspective higher than her own 2 feet, was intoxicating. It was an act of rebellion, a reclamation of a simple joy that had been denied her. She began to ride every day, venturing a little farther each time, exploring the pine-scented foothills and the grassy meadows. She was not running from anything anymore. She was moving toward herself. A subtle shift occurred in the cabin. The silence that had once been a barrier became a comfortable space. They started eating their meals at the same time, not out of obligation, but out of a shared rhythm. One evening, as she served him a bowl of stew, he told a dry, short story about a stubborn bull, and a small, surprising sound escaped her lips. A laugh. It was rusty from disuse, but it was real. His eyes crinkled at the corners in a ghost of a smile, and after that, the laughter came a little easier. They fell into the habit of sharing coffee at sunrise. She would rise in the pre-dawn chill to start the fire, and he would come in from his first check of the animals, bringing the cold, clean scent of the morning with him. They would sit at the table, their hands wrapped around warm tin mugs, watching the sky bleed from purple to pink to gold through the small cabin window. They spoke very little, but in the shared quiet, a companionship took root and began to grow. She learned the landscape of his face, the way a small muscle in his jaw would tighten when he was worried, the network of fine lines around his eyes that deepened when he was tired. And he, in turn, seemed to learn the quiet language of her moods, knowing when to offer a second cup of coffee and when to leave her to her thoughts. One evening after dinner, he brought his rifle to the table and began to clean it with methodical, practiced movements. Eleanor watched him, her hands busy with her mending.
Thomas never let me touch his guns,
she said quietly, the words surprising even herself. He said a woman's hands were too foolish for such things. Daniel paused, a clean, oiled rag in his hand. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. He did not say that Thomas was a fool. He did not offer empty reassurances. He simply stood up, walked to the gun rack by the door, and took down a smaller, lighter rifle. He laid it on the table in front of her. "This was Sarah's," he said, his voice soft.
"She was a better shot than me."
He spent the next hour teaching her. He showed her how to load the rifle, how to hold it snug against her shoulder, how to sight down the long, steel barrel. His instructions were clear and patient. When he stood behind her to adjust her stance, he was careful not to touch her, his hands hovering in the space around her, his presence a warm, steady guide. The next day, he set up a line of tin cans on a fence post 50 yards from the cabin. The first time she fired the rifle, the sharp crack made her flinch, and the kick of the stock against her shoulder was a brutal, surprising force. But as she grew used to it, a strange sense of power began to fill her. It was not a power over anyone else. It was the power to protect herself, the power to make a loud noise in a world that had demanded her silence. When she finally hit one of the cans, sending it spinning into the air with a satisfying ping, a fierce, triumphant smile broke across her face. Daniel, leaning against the porch rail, nodded in approval, a quiet pride in his eyes that was for her, and her alone. Their life together found its defining moment on a warm afternoon in early autumn. A frantic whinnying from the direction of the river sent them both running. They found the source of the distress a half-mile downstream. A young foal, not more than a few months old, had wandered into a boggy patch of riverbank and was now sunk up to its belly in thick, sucking mud. Its mother, a wild mare from a herd that roamed the high country, circled the bank in a panic, calling out to her trapped offspring. "The mare won't let me near," Daniel said, his face grim. "We'll have to get a rope around him, but she'll charge if I get too close." "I can distract her," Eleanor said, her mind working quickly. "You get the rope." Before he could protest, she was moving, circling wide around the panicked mare, making herself a more immediate and less predictable threat. The mare's attention shifted to her, its ears flattening, its teeth bared. While the horse was focused on Eleanor, Daniel managed to wade into the mud and slip a rope around the foal's chest. What followed was a chaotic, desperate struggle. Daniel pulled on the rope while Eleanor, using a fallen branch, tried to dig the mud away from the foal's flailing legs. The mud was a greedy, powerful thing, refusing to release its captive. The cold river water soaked them both, plastering their clothes to their skin. At one point, Eleanor lost her footing and fell face first into the bog, coming up sputtering, her hair and face coated in a thick brown slurry. Daniel looked over at her, his own face streaked with mud, and a grin, a real, wide grin, split his face. "You look a sight," he said, a chuckle in his voice. Seeing him, seeing herself, seeing the ridiculousness of their situation. Something inside Eleanor snapped. A bubble of laughter rose in her chest, and then another, until she was laughing uncontrollably. A wild, helpless, joyous sound that echoed across the river. She laughed until her sides ached, until tears streamed down her muddy cheeks. The sound was so foreign, so unexpected, that even the panicked mare paused in its frantic pacing to stare at her. The foal, perhaps encouraged by the strange sound, gave one last mighty heave, and with Daniel's final pull, it lurched free from the mud. It scrambled onto solid ground, shook itself, and trotted on wobbly legs to its grateful mother. The mare gave them one last suspicious look before nudging her young one away, disappearing into the willows. Eleanor and Daniel were left on the riverbank, soaked, filthy, and utterly exhausted. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A cold wind was picking up, and Eleanor began to shiver. "We need to get you warm," Daniel said, his laughter gone, his voice low with concern. He led the way to a small line shack that stood on a bluff overlooking the river, a place he used for shelter during long cattle drives. Inside, he built a fire in the small stone hearth while Eleanor tried to wring the water from her clothes. He had a couple of dry, scratchy wool blankets, and he handed one to her. There was no question of modesty. They stripped off their wet, muddy clothes and wrapped themselves in the blankets, huddling on opposite sides of the growing fire. As the warmth seeped back into their bodies, a comfortable silence fell between them. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. They sat there for a long time, watching the flames, the shared struggle, the ridiculousness of the mud, the wild, cleansing laughter. It had washed away the last of the barriers between them. Eleanor looked at him. The firelight flickered across the planes of his face, softening the hard lines, making the gray of his eyes seem as deep and warm as smoke. He was looking at her, too, his expression unreadable but intense. The space between them, which had once been a chasm, now felt small enough to cross. Slowly, she moved, shifting on the hard-packed earth floor until she was sitting beside him. He did not move, did not breathe. She could feel the heat of his body, could smell the scent of wood smoke and damp earth that clung to him. Her heart was a wild bird, beating against the cage of her ribs. This was her choice, her moment. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was a slow, trembling kiss, full of 1,000 unspoken things, her fear, her gratitude, her burgeoning desire. His lips were chapped and firm beneath hers. For a moment, he was completely still, as if in shock. Then he responded, his hand coming up to gently cup her jaw, his touch as hesitant and reverent as a prayer. And then, just as the kiss began to deepen, he pulled away. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his own filled with a fierce, tender question. His thumb stroked her cheek, a touch that asked for nothing. "We don't have to," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Not unless you're sure." His words, his gentle release, the unwavering respect in his eyes. It was everything. She leaned her forehead against the solid wall of his chest, the scratchy wool of the blanket a comforting reality against her skin. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her ear. "I'm not sure I'll ever be sure," she confessed, her voice muffled against his chest. It was the truest thing she had ever said. The wounds inside her were deep. Certainty was a luxury for people who had not been broken. "But I want you." The words were a revelation, a discovery. "I've never wanted anything before." That was the key. Her life had been a series of things she had endured, things that had been done to her. This was the first thing she had ever actively, truly wanted. He did not speak. He simply shifted, his arm coming around her, pulling her close. That night, in the warm, flickering glow of the fire, they touched. It was hesitant at first, a slow, careful exploration. His hands, calloused and rough from work, were impossibly gentle on her skin. He learned the map of her body with a reverence that made her want to weep. His touch, not a demand, but a question. And she, in turn, discovered the strength and the sorrow held in the hard lines of his body. The hesitation gave way to a fierce, desperate hunger, a need to erase the years of loneliness and pain. But just as their passion crested, a ghost from the past rose up, a memory of Thomas, a flash of fear, a feeling of being trapped. A sob caught in her throat, and a tear slipped from her eye, hot against her skin. He stopped. Instantly, he pulled back, his own desire forgotten. He gathered her into his arms, pulling the blanket around her, holding her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. He rocked her gently, his lips against her hair. "You're safe," he whispered, the words a mantra against the tide of her fear. "I've got you. You're safe here." He held her like that until the tears subsided. until the violent trembling in her body stilled. He made no move to continue, no hint of pressure or disappointment. He just held her, offering the simple, profound comfort of his presence, and in the safety of his arms, she finally, truly, let go and drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke, the first light of dawn was filtering through the cracks in the shack walls. The fire was a bed of glowing embers. She was alone on the pile of blankets, tucked in and warm. A moment of pure, cold panic seized her. He was gone. He had taken what he wanted and left. She scrambled up, pulling the blanket around her, and rushed to the door. She pushed it open, her heart in her throat. And there he was. He was sitting on a log a few feet away, staring out at the sunrise. A small fire was burning, a tin coffee pot resting on a grate above it. He must have heard the door open, because he turned his head. His face was calm, his gray eyes clear and steady. There was no regret in them, no accusation. He simply looked at her, and a small, gentle smile touched his lips. He lifted his tin mug in a silent offer. He had been waiting for her, not with expectation, not with demand, but with coffee and the quiet promise of a new day. The journey back from the line shack was a silent one, but the silence had changed. It was no longer an absence of words, but a presence of feeling. The fragile intimacy they had found by the fire was a flickering candle flame they now carried back into the daylight, shielding it against a world that would surely try to snuff it out. In the small routines of the ranch, a new tenderness bloomed. A shared glance across the breakfast table held a world of meaning. The brush of his fingers against hers as he handed her a pail of water was no longer a threat, but a small, electric shock of connection. It was a love that had not yet learned its own name, a fragile seedling pushing its way up through scorched earth. But their valley was not the entire world. The world, with its sharp edges and long memory, lay down the trail in Jericho Springs. A month after the first snows had dusted the high peaks, their supplies ran low, and a trip to town became unavoidable. As they rode side by side down the main street, Eleanor felt the familiar weight of public opinion settle upon her shoulders. The whispers had not died down. They had only found a new target. The stares were no longer just for her. The cold widow, they were for him, too. The women who had once offered her false pity now looked at her with a new, venomous contempt. Their eyes slid from her to Daniel. Their lips pursed in judgment. So soon, their expressions seemed to say, "The grieving widow finds comfort in another man's bed." The men on the boardwalk watched Daniel with a different kind of look, a mixture of envy and accusation. They saw him not as a savior, but as an opportunist who had taken advantage of a vulnerable woman. Eleanor kept her eyes forward, her spine rigid, but she could feel Daniel's discomfort beside her. He, who was so at home in the vast silences of the mountains, was a stranger here, in this cramped space of petty gossip and suspicion. He ignored the stares, his face set in a stony mask, but a muscle ticked in his jaw, betraying his tension. Their fragile peace was no match for the poison of a small town. The true test, however, was not waiting on the street, but inside the bank, as Daniel was negotiating for a better price on winter feed with Mr. Henderson. Eleanor saw him, Mr. Abernathy, the banker, stepped out of his office, his fleshy face lighting up with a predator's smile when he saw her. Mrs. Webb," he said, his voice oozing a false cordiality. "And Mr. Hayes. What an interesting pairing." He ignored Daniel and directed his words to Eleanor. "I was just reviewing some old accounts. I have some documents I believe you will want to see concerning your late husband's property." A cold dread washed over Eleanor. Daniel finished his business and came to stand beside her. His presence a solid, protective wall, but Abernathy's words were a corrosive acid, eating through any sense of safety. "I have no business with you, Mr. Abernathy," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "Oh, but you do. Or rather, Mr. Hayes does, the banker replied, his eyes gleaming with malice. He held up a sheaf of papers. It seems the outstanding mortgage on the Webb homestead, the loans, all the debts. They have all been settled, paid in full. Eleanor stared at him, confused. That is impossible. I have no money. You do not, Abernathy agreed smugly. But your benefactor here does. He settled every last penny of Thomas Webb's debt, a remarkably generous act for a simple neighbor. Would you not agree? The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Eleanor turned to look at Daniel, her mind reeling. His face was grim, his jaw tight. He did not deny it. He had paid her debts, the debts that had driven her into the wilderness, the debts that had given Abernathy the power to threaten her, and he had never said a word. The banker, seeing the shock and confusion on her face, pressed his advantage. The deed is clear. The land is now legally yours, free and clear. A gift, you might say, from Mr. Hayes. Abernathy's insinuation was a poisoned dart, and it found its mark in the deepest, most wounded part of Eleanor's soul. A gift, a payment, a transaction. All her old fears, all the lessons Thomas had taught her about the nature of men and their charity, came rushing back. Men did not give gifts without expecting something in return. Kindness was a down payment on a future claim. She felt a wave of nausea. She turned and walked out of the mercantile, her movements stiff, robotic. Daniel followed her, his boots heavy on the boardwalk behind her. He caught up to her at the edge of town, where their horses were tied. "Eleanor," he began, his voice low. She spun on him, her eyes blazing with the fire of a fresh, terrible wound. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Yes," he said simply, his face etched with a misery that she was too blinded by her own pain to see. "Why?" she cried, the word tearing from her throat. "Why would you do that?" "Abernathy was circling," he said, his voice rough. "I would not let him have you." His words, meant to be a comfort, were like fuel on the fire of her fear. "Have you?" As if she were a prize to be won, a property to be claimed. All the tenderness, all the gentle patience, all the shared sunrises, it all seemed like a lie now, a calculated strategy to win her trust, to indebt her to him in a way that was more binding than any mortgage. "So you bought me instead?" she accused, her voice dripping with the bitter acid of betrayal. "Was that the plan? Settle my debts, take me in, and wait for me to be grateful? Am I just another piece of property to you, Daniel, something you acquired?" The color drained from his face. He looked as if she had struck him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He was stunned into silence by the force of her accusation, by the depth of her misunderstanding. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not anger, but a profound and devastating hurt. But she could not see it clearly. All she could see was the reflection of her own past, of Thomas's transactional cruelty. His silence was her answer. It was a confirmation of her deepest, most terrifying fears. He would not even deny it. "I see," she whispered, her heart a cold, dead weight in her chest. Without another word, she untied Willow's reins, mounted the mare, and dug her heels into its sides. She did not look back. She rode away from him, away from the town, but she did not ride toward the safety of his valley. She rode toward the one place she had sworn she would never return, the derelict homestead where she had lived with Thomas Webb. She needed answers, and the only place to find them was in the heart of her own private hell. The cabin was just as she had left it, a sad, empty shell filled with ghosts and dust. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of decay and memory. She moved through the small room like a sleepwalker, her mind numb. She did not know what she was looking for. A clue, an explanation, anything to make sense of the new chaos in her world. She started with Thomas's things, a small wooden box where he kept his important papers. Most of it was meaningless. Old receipts, a bill of sale for a horse long dead. But at the very bottom, tucked inside a folded piece of oilcloth, was a letter. It was in his familiar, spiky handwriting. It was addressed to her. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. It was not a letter, she realized. It was his will, a cruel, final act of control from beyond the grave. It was short and vicious. He left her the property and all its debts, but with one final, binding condition. She is to remain my widow. He had written, if she ever remarries, or takes another man into her bed and home, the property and everything on it is to be forfeited to my brother. Samuel Webb. Eleanor sank onto a chair, the paper crinkling in her clenched fist. It was a chain, forged in hatred, meant to bind her to him even in death. He had ensured she would remain alone, impoverished, and forever his. And Daniel. Daniel had tried to break that chain. He had not been buying her. He had been trying to set her free. The thought was a painful, staggering realization. Overwhelmed, she fled the cabin and rode back into town, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and a dawning, terrible understanding. She had to know the truth of what Daniel had done. She went not to the bank, but to the land office. The clerk was a small, balding man with spectacles perched on his nose. He remembered the transaction. "Oh yes, the old Webb place," he said, pulling a large ledger from a shelf. "Caused a bit of a stir. A man came in, paid off the mortgage in cash. Had to sell a piece of his own land to do it." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "What land?" she whispered. The clerk ran a dusty finger down a column. "Daniel Hayes sold off 40 acres of his northern pasture. Best grazing land in the whole valley. Got a fair price for it, but I cannot imagine why he would sell it. A man like him needs every acre he can get." 40 acres. He had sold a part of his own dream, a part of his future, just to keep her safe from a past she could not escape. The scale of his sacrifice, of his silent, selfless care, was so immense it physically hurt her to comprehend it. The guilt of her accusation was a sharp, physical pain in her chest. As she stumbled out of the land office, her mind reeling, her world was upended for a third time that day. A man in a dusty coat stepped in front of her. He was young, with a nervous energy about him. He touched the brim of his hat and showed her a small tin badge. "Ma'am," he said, "I am Deputy Miller. The sheriff would like a word with you." "What about?" she asked, her voice a thin thread. "Just some new questions about the fire at your husband's place," he said, his eyes shifting uncomfortably. "There are rumors. Some folks are saying it might have been deliberate." The world narrowed to a single point of terror. The whispers had finally grown teeth. She was no longer just the subject of gossip. She was a suspect. The deputy led her toward the sheriff's office, the walk of 100 yards feeling like a mile. People on the street stopped to stare, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and condemnation. She was alone, cornered, the full weight of the town's suspicion finally bearing down on her. They were standing on the steps of the sheriff's office when a horse clattered to a stop in the street behind them. It was Daniel. He swung down from the saddle, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. He did not look at the deputy. He did not look at the gawking townspeople. He looked only at her. He walked directly to her, his long strides eating up the distance between them. He stopped in front of her, and in the full, unforgiving light of the public square, he reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm, solid, an anchor in the storm. It was not a gesture of possession, but of unwavering, absolute solidarity. He turned to the deputy, his voice low and steady, but carrying a force that made the younger man flinch. "If you charge her," Daniel said, his gray eyes as hard as granite. "You charge me." The words hung in the air, a public and irrevocable declaration. He was lashing his fate to hers, standing between her and the town, between her and the law. He was taking her shame, her suspicion, her entire broken past onto his own shoulders. That night, back in the quiet safety of the valley, the dam of Eleanor's emotions finally broke. She wept in his arms, her body shaking with a storm of guilt and gratitude so profound it left her breathless. She cried for her cruelty to him, for his impossible kindness to her. He did not offer words of forgiveness. They were not needed. He just held her, his hand stroking her hair, his steady presence a promise that she was no longer alone in the dark. Later, in the warm glow of the fire, they came together again. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear. The ghosts of the past had been faced down in the public square, and they had lost their power. Their lovemaking was not the desperate, frantic release of their first encounter. It was a slow, deep, deliberate act of connection. Every touch was a vow, every kiss a promise. It was the careful, tender joining of two broken souls who, in their shared wreckage, had finally found a way to be whole. It was not a release of passion, but the solemn, quiet forging of a future. The quiet declaration Daniel made in front of the sheriff's office was not the end of their trials, but the beginning of a different kind of life. The cloud of suspicion that had hung over Eleanor did not vanish overnight, but his unshakable faith in her acted as a shield. The sheriff, a man who dealt in facts rather than rumors, concluded there was no evidence of foul play in the barn fire, and the matter was officially closed. The whispers in town did not fall silent, but they lowered in volume, their venom diluted by the simple, undeniable fact of Daniel's public support. In the safety of the valley, Eleanor began the slow, painful work of unpacking the baggage of her past. It began in the deep of night, after a nightmare had left her trembling and slick with sweat. Daniel was there, as he always was, holding her, his voice a low rumble of comfort in the dark. This time, instead of just accepting his comfort, she found the courage to speak the nightmare aloud.
"He was there,"
she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing.
"Thomas, he was laughing, telling me I would never be free."
She expected Daniel to offer simple reassurances, to tell her it was only a dream. Instead, he just held her tighter and said, "Tell me more." And so she did. For the first time, she spoke not just of the big, ugly acts of cruelty like the root cellar, but of the thousand small, daily humiliations. The way Thomas would mock her reading, the way he would inspect her cooking as if looking for fault, the casual dismissals, the cold silences that were a punishment for some unknown transgression. She spoke of the suffocating loneliness, of the slow, grinding erosion of her own self-worth. The words were stones she'd carried in her heart for years, and as she gave them voice, she could feel their weight begin to lift. Daniel listened, his silence not empty, but full of a deep and patient empathy. He did not judge. He did not offer solutions. He simply bore witness to her pain, and in doing so, he gave it a place to rest. Her newfound voice, once tested in the safety of Daniel's arms, began to find its strength in the world outside. During a trip to town, she saw Mrs. Gable, the pastor's wife, speaking in hushed, pitying tones to a young woman named Clara, who had recently been married off to a grim-faced blacksmith twice her age. Eleanor saw the same haunted, trapped look in Clara's eyes that had once lived in her own. Later that week, Clara appeared at the ranch, a purple bruise blooming on her cheek, her eyes wide with terror. She had fled after her husband had flown into a rage over a burnt meal. Eleanor did not hesitate. She took the girl in, gave her a warm blanket and a hot cup of tea, and looked her straight in the eye. "You are safe here," Eleanor told her, the words echoing the promise Daniel had once made to her. "You can stay as long as you need. You can work for your keep. No one will lay a hand on you here." Daniel, when he returned from the fields, saw the girl huddled by the fire and simply nodded, accepting her presence without question. The ranch, once a sanctuary for one broken soul, was now a refuge for two. Clara's presence changed the dynamic of the small household. She was young and resilient, and her quiet gratitude and hero worship of Eleanor slowly chipped away at the last of Eleanor's self-doubt. In teaching Clara how to cook on the old wood stove, how to mend, how to ride Willow, Eleanor found herself becoming the strong, capable woman she had never believed she could be. Her strength began to reshape the ranch itself. She had a keen eye and a practical mind. Things Thomas had tried to beat out of her. She saw that the chickens, left to roam, were not laying as well as they could. She designed and helped Daniel build a proper hen house, and soon they had a surplus of eggs to trade in town. She remembered her father, a failed farmer but a knowledgeable one, talking about crop rotation. She convinced Daniel to plant a field of clover to replenish the soil in a pasture that had been overgrazed. Jeb and Walt, the ranch hands, who had once viewed her with suspicion, now watched her with a grudging respect. They saw that her ideas worked. The ranch, under her and Daniel's joint care, began to thrive in a way it never had before. And with her strength, her laughter returned. It was no longer a rare, surprising sound, but a frequent and welcome one. It rang out across the valley when a calf kicked over a pail of milk, when Daniel told one of his dry, understated jokes, when she and Clara chased chickens across the yard. The sound of it seemed to heal the very air, chasing away the last of the shadows. One evening in the late spring, as the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long, golden fingers of light across the valley, Daniel came to her as she was standing by the corral. He did not speak for a long time, just stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching.
"I think,"
he said finally, his voice low,
"that it is time."
She knew what he meant. She had known it for months. She simply nodded, a quiet joy blooming in her chest. They were married 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning. There was no pastor, no crowd of onlookers. Their only witnesses were the sky, the mountains, and the whispering pines. They stood beneath the great solitary pine tree on the hill, the place where Sarah and Sammy rested. It was Eleanor's idea. She said she did not want to start a new life by pretending the old one did not exist. She wanted to build their future on the foundations of all that had come before, the joy and the sorrow, the love and the loss. She wore a simple blue dress, the color of the mountain sky. She wore no veil to hide her face, no fancy shoes. Her only adornment was a circlet of wildflowers she and Clara had gathered that morning, a crown of purple lupine and yellow buttercups woven into her dark hair. Daniel wore a clean shirt and his usual look of solemn, steadfast love. They did not exchange rings. They exchanged vows, simple words spoken from the heart, promises of loyalty and care, of shared sunrises and a shared future. When he kissed her, his lips were gentle, a promise of a lifetime of kindness. Their life together was not a fairy tale. The past was not a door that could be slammed shut and locked. It was a landscape they still had to navigate. Eleanor still woke from nightmares sometimes, the phantom grip of Thomas's anger reaching for her even in sleep. But now, she did not wake alone. Daniel was there, his solid presence a lighthouse in the dark, guiding her back to the safe harbor of the present. And Daniel had his own ghosts. Sometimes Eleanor would find him staring at the old tintype photograph of his first family, his face a mask of such profound, quiet grief that it made her heart ache. She learned not to intrude on those moments. She would just make a fresh pot of coffee and wait for him to come back to her, knowing that his love for Sarah and Sammy did not diminish his love for her. It was simply a part of the vast, complex, and beautiful landscape of his heart. Their love was not perfect, but it was real, made stronger by the scars they both carried. The final ghost of the past arrived on a hot, dusty afternoon in the middle of summer. A man on a fancy horse rode into the ranch yard. He was stout and florid-faced, dressed in a city suit that was out of place in the rugged valley. He looked around with an air of arrogant ownership. "I am looking for the woman who calls herself Eleanor Webb," he announced, his voice loud and bullying. Eleanor stepped out of the cabin. with Daniel right behind her.
"I am Eleanor,"
she said, her voice calm. "I am Samuel Webb," he declared, puffing out his chest. "Thomas's brother, and according to his legally binding will, this land and everything on it is mine." He had come to collect. News of her life with Daniel had finally reached him, and he had come to enforce the cruel, final clause of Thomas's will. "You are living here with this man," Samuel sneered, gesturing at Daniel. "You have broken the terms of the will. The law is on my side. Now pack your things and get off my property." This was the final confrontation, the last chain that needed to be broken. But Eleanor was not the same terrified, broken woman who had cowered before Mr. Abernathy. She was no longer alone. Daniel moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers, their fingers lacing together. But it was Eleanor who spoke.
"Let us go to town,"
she said, her voice clear and steady.
"Let us settle this in front of the sheriff and the whole town, so there are no more secrets and no more whispers."
The scene in front of the sheriff's office was a repeat of the one months before. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The crowd that gathered was not just curious. They were watching, waiting. Samuel Webb stood on the steps, his face red with blustering indignation, waving his brother's will like a conquering flag. Eleanor stood before him, with Daniel a silent, solid presence at her side. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply pulled a set of folded documents from her pocket, the deed from the land office, the bank receipts Abernathy had given her.
"This is the last will and testament of my late husband, Thomas Webb,"
she began, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. She read the cruel clause aloud. For all to hear, Samuel Webb smiled, a smug, triumphant look on his face.
"But,"
Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength,
"what this will does not account for is the fact that the property was never truly his to give.
It was owned by the bank, collateral for a mountain of debt." She unfolded the other papers. "These are the bank receipts, showing that every last penny of that debt was paid, and this," she held up the final document, "is the new deed to the land, issued by the Territory Land Office. It is free and clear of any and all previous claims. It is in my name, and mine alone." She calmly and clearly explained what Daniel had done, how he had sold his own land to secure her freedom. She did not do it to praise him, but to lay the truth bare for all to see. Samuel Webb's face went from red to a pasty white. His blustering arguments died in his throat. He was a bully, and in the face of her calm, unassailable truth, he had no power. Eleanor folded the documents and looked directly at him, but her final words were for the whole town, for anyone who had ever whispered about her, pitied her, or judged her.
"You may remember me as the woman who was hurt,"
she said, her voice ringing with a strength she had earned through fire and tears.
"But I am also the woman who lived."
She turned, took Daniel's hand, and they walked away, leaving Samuel Webb standing alone and speechless on the steps. A quiet murmur went through the crowd. The way people looked at her had changed. The pity was gone. The suspicion was gone. In their place was a new and profound respect. They were no longer looking at a victim. They were looking at a survivor. The following spring, Daniel began building a porch onto the front of the cabin. It was his idea. "A place to sit," he'd said. "A place to watch the world without having to be in it." He worked with a slow, steady skill, the sound of his hammer a rhythmic, comforting beat in the quiet valley air. One afternoon, Eleanor sat on the top step of the half-finished porch, a basket of mending in her lap, the warm sun on her face. The valley was green and alive, the air sweet with the scent of pine and new grass. Daniel came and sat beside her, his work done for the day. He smelled of sawdust and sweat. He did not speak, but leaned back on his elbows, his face turned up to the wide, blue sky. After a long, comfortable silence, he reached for her hand, His touch was warm and firm. It was a simple gesture, one they had shared 1,000 times, but in its simplicity was the whole of their story. It was not the grasping, bruising grip of possession she had once known. It was the gentle, steady clasp of a partner, a friend, a husband. He was not taking her hand to own it. He was just holding it. And in his touch, she was not broken. She was home. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. And we invite you to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.